Okay, solving quadratic equations, method 2, which is square roots. Method 1 was factoring, so square roots. In this method, we are directly solving by isolating the variable. It's kind of like when we were solving linear equations. Okay. Sorry, the recording on this kind of lagged, so it'll pop up in a second. Okay, so directly solve by isolating the variable. Now, there are some scenarios that you can only use this for. Okay, there it is. Only use if the equation involves a square and a constant. So you need a squared term and a constant term. Okay. What that means is you cannot have any first degree terms. You cannot have any linear terms. So in standard form, that's your bx term. So this only works if there's an ax squared part and a c part. So there can't be anything with an x, just an x. So either x squareds or constants, no x's. So the steps for this. Step 1 is to isolate the squared part, the squared term or the squared part. Just like in the linear equation, you were isolating x. This time we're isolating x squared or whatever is being squared, whether it's a term, an individual term, or a part, a whole part of it. Step 2 is, well, you have to get rid of the squared part because we don't care about x squared, we only care about x. So you have to square root both sides. And then step 3 is the easy one. You solve for x. Okay, we've been solving for x for, the entire year. You won't always have to do step 3, but if you have to, solve for x. There are some things to remember when you're dealing with square roots. Okay, there's 2 things you always have to remember. The first one is that you cannot take the square root of a negative because nothing times itself is going to give you a negative answer. So you can never have a square root. You can never have a negative number under your square root. It's going to be no solution. And step 2 is remember that all square roots give you 2 answers. Okay. All square roots yield a positive answer and a negative answer. So the square root of 100 is positive 10 and it's also negative 10. So you're going to have 2 answers, which is, again, typical of quadratic equations. Okay, so let's solve a couple of these. Okay, remember our steps. Isolate the square root term, the squared term or part, square root both sides, and then solve for x if needed. Okay. And then remember, no square root of a negative. All square roots yield 2 answers, a positive and a negative version. All right, so this first one, 2x squared minus 32 equals 0. Okay. Now again, usually for factoring, we want it to equal 0. But for the square root method, we're not. We're just solving directly for x. So again, and also notice there's no x term. There's an x squared and there's a constant, but there's no x. Okay. So we need to isolate the x squared part. Okay. So remember, just like solving equations way back in the first quarter, you just go piece by piece. Start furthest away from what you're trying to isolate. Okay. So we'll add 32 to both sides. 2x squared equals 32. Again, trying to isolate the x squared part. So anything that's not that x squared part needs to go to the other side, which is the 2 out front. So 2 times x squared, so we divide by 2. And that leaves us with x squared equals 16. Okay. We've isolated the x squared part. Step 1 is done. Step 2, square root both sides. Okay, we have x squared equals 16. We need it to be x equals something. So to get rid of the square part, we take the square root. Okay. The square root of x squared is just x. Remember, the square root and the square kind of cancel out. The square root of 16 is 4. Okay, but it's not just 4, it's positive or negative, plus or minus 4. All right, so we get 2 answers for this. We get the answer x equals 4. And we get the answer x equals negative 4. Okay. So 2 answers, which is typical of a quadratic. Alright, so that was isolating a term. This one's isolating a part. So notice on this one that the entire left side is the squared part. Okay. There's nothing outside of the squared part that we could add or subtract. So we just have to go through right away and do step 2. Step 1's already basically done for us because it's isolated. The only thing on the left side is that squared part. So from here, we're just going to move to step 2 and take the square root of both sides. So you're going to take the square root of that entire thing, x plus 2 squared. Okay, again, the square root and the square cancel out. and you're left with x plus 2 equals the square root of 49. Well, the square root of 49 is positive or negative plus or minus 7. Okay. Alright, so now we just solve for x. On the first problem, we didn't have to solve for x. This time we do. We need to get x by itself. So we'll subtract 2 on both sides. Just solving a linear equation at this point. So our answer is x equals plus or minus 7 minus 2. Okay. But what does that really mean? Well, you have to split that up. Okay. We have two answers here. We have positive 7 minus 2 and we have negative 7 minus 2. So you're going to have to do one for each. So your first answer will be x equals positive 7 minus 2. Your second answer is going to be x equals negative 7 minus 2. Because again, this plus or minus is just shorthand, so we don't have to write it twice. But ultimately, you do have to write it twice. So x equals 7 minus 2, 5. X equals negative 7 minus 2, okay, which is negative 9. So you don't always get the same number. Sometimes you do. In that first problem, we got the same numbers, positive 4 and negative 4. This problem we didn't. We got positive 5 and negative 9. So don't just get one answer and then automatically assume that the other one's going to be negative. Okay. Example 3. Okay, this one's like the first one. We need to isolate the x squared part. Okay, it's not in parentheses, so that 3 can go away, but not in the first step. The first step, we're going to start furthest away. Start on the outsides. Work your way in. Add 4 to both sides. Gives us 3x squared equals 27. Okay. Again, trying to isolate x squared. So we got that 3 out front. We're going to have to get rid of that. Divide by 3 on both sides. X squared equals 9. So x squared equals 9. Alright, square root both sides. You got the x squared by itself. Square root both sides. X squared, square root of that cancels out. So you're left with x equals, square root of 9 is 3, so plus or minus 3. Okay. You could write it separately, or for a problem like this, you could just leave it as plus or minus. I know what that means. Okay, moving on. Example 4. Again, if you want to try these before I do it, pause it, try it for yourself, see if we get the same answer. This one's going to be a little special. So on this one, we are, the squared term is the x minus 3. It's that whole thing squared. So we're going to have to kind of keep that together, but it still has to be by itself. So this minus 6 has to go. Okay. So the squared term in this case is that entire x minus 3 squared. Okay. So we got x minus 3 squared. It's now isolated. It's by itself. Equals 2 minus 6, negative 4. Okay. So step 1 is done. We've isolated the squared part, or the squared term. So now we move on to step 2. We take the square root of both sides. Okay. So square root of the left side, square root of the right side. Okay. Well, what's the problem here? Well, the square root on the left side cancels out, and you're left with x minus 3. The square root on the right side, again, you have to be careful. Always remember, you cannot take the square root of a negative. Square root of 4 is 2, plus or minus 2, but square root of negative 4 doesn't exist in real numbers. So since you can't take the square root of a negative, this one's just no solution. Now in Algebra 2, that one will have a solution, but for Algebra 1, we can't take square root of negatives, so it's no solution. So anytime you run into that, anytime you have you're in the square root step, and it's going to make you take the square root of a negative, you can stop right there. Automatically, no solution. Okay, we'll do a couple more. Isolate the squared part. Okay. Usually it's a plus or a minus. This time it's a 2 out front that we're going to have to get rid of. So we'll divide both sides by 2. Okay. Leaves behind x plus 3 squared equals 7. Okay. Step 1 is done. Move on to step 2, which is square root both sides. Okay. Square root and the square cancel out. Leaves you with x plus 3 on the left. Equals the square root of 7. The square root of 7 isn't a whole number. It's actually an irrational number because 7's prime. So we can't put a number there. We're just going to have to leave it as the square root of 7. Or rather, since we get positive and negative answers, the square root of 7 is just plus or minus the square root of 7. Okay, so you can't simplify that. And also don't write it as a decimal. Just leave it, it's called exact form. Okay, because again, that's going to be an irrational number, so it's never going to repeat. It's never going to end. So just leave it in an exact form, which involves the square root of 7. So just leave it square root of 7. These actually end up being a little easier. Okay. So, we just try to keep going. We'll isolate the x part, which means we'll have to subtract 3 over. Okay. Now, if you remember when we were adding and subtracting radicals, you can't add or subtract radicals unless they have the same number in the radicand. So this one we have a radical and we have a whole number. We can't combine those. You can't do 7 minus 3 is 4 and then keep going from there. So what we really have is we have the plus or minus the square root of 7 minus 3. Okay. We can't really simplify that. Okay, we're going to just leave it in this form. This is called exact form. Okay, that's the exact answer. Now, the square root of 7 minus 3, I don't really know what that is. So sometimes it is good to have approximate answers. So if you want to have an approximate answer, you would do x equals, and in your calculator you could do the square root of 7 minus 3. Okay. The square root of 7 is like 2.7. Okay. And the square root of 7 minus 3 is approximately, because we're going to have to round, it's approximately negative 0.35. Okay. And then you'd have to do it again, because remember, it's not just square root of 7, it's also negative square root of 7. Negative square root of 7 minus 3 is approximately negative 5.65. So those are our approximate answers. And up above is our exact answer. Okay. Usually I prefer the exact answer, but again, remember when we're solving quadratics, we're finding the x-intercepts. So if you tell me the x-intercept is square root of 7 minus 3, I can't really graph that. But I can graph negative 0.35 and I can graph negative 5.65. Alright, I think this is the last one. Yep. Same thing, this one's going to be the longest one. Always last. We need to isolate the squared part. Okay. Start furthest away, so we're going to have to add 8 to both sides. Leaves behind 2 times x minus 4 squared equals 40. Okay. Step 1's not done yet. We're not isolated. It could be a quarantine joke. Divide by 2 on both sides. X minus 4 on the left squared. So step 1's now done. Equals 40 divided by 2, which is 20. Okay. Step 1, move on to step 2. That entire term is being squared, so we're going to have to square root the entire term. That goes away. X minus 4 equals, once again, the square root of 20 is not a perfect square. So the square root of 20 is just going to stay plus or minus square root of 20. Alright, however, 20 is not a prime number. Okay. So, we could actually simplify that radical. 20 breaks down, remember doing the factor trees, into 10 and 2. Breaks down again, 10 breaks down into 5 and 2. Okay. So we now have a group of 2's. Remember, we're looking for groups of 2's to pull out to the front. So instead of plus or minus the square root of 20, we have plus or minus 2. That group of 2 goes out. And then that leftover 5 is going to have to stay inside. So plus or minus 2 square root of 5. And the left side, x minus 4. Alright, so now we can go ahead and finish solving this problem. We still need to isolate x. We still need to solve for x. So we have to add 4 on both sides. Add 4 on both sides. Now once again, you can't combine the radical part with the non-radical part. So our answer here is just going to be x equals, and I'm just going to leave this in exact form, which is just going to be 2 square root of 5 plus or minus 2 square root of 5 plus 4. Okay. Now again, if you want your approximate answers in the calculator, you'd have to do 2 square root of 5 plus 4 and then negative 2 square root of 5 plus 4. Okay. I'm going to leave that one in exact form. And that is method 2. So just 3 steps. Isolate the squared part, square root both sides, and then solve for x if needed. Okay. Remember, can't take square root of a negative, and every square root yields 2 results. Okay. You get a positive answer and a negative answer.